Hello, everyone, and welcome to another DVD Coaches Call. I'm really excited for this one. Actually, we've talked about doing this quite a few times, but I have finally bit the bullet, and I'm kind of putting myself out here and doing these. So, in the effort of sounding smarter than I actually am, I'm going to put some glasses on first. Today, we want to go over some athlete case studies. Can you guys see my screen yet? Let's see. There we go. Okay, so we want to go over some athlete case studies. Now, what's really interesting is I wanted to pick out four kind of separate categories of these, going over injury, plateau, mental health, and then an actual like on competition day handling scenario. All of these are going to really heavily feature programming throughout them. I brought a lot of excerpts from their programming documents across so that we can kind of explain a few things as we go through. But the primary thing that we want to do today is go over each of the following athletes' protocols and responses. So this is George, Kaylani, Kyle, and Sophie. Each of these are like, I wanted to get a representation of male and female of like lighter and heavier weight classes, so you can see some of the programming implications that can sometimes happen with that. So a baseline principle before I get into any of this and before we start up is that progress is never given, it is earned. And although programming is immensely important from the coach athlete perspective, none of it actually matters if athletes are not in them and of themselves independently successful, right? It's really important to note you can do a fantastic job as a coach in programming and an athlete not be independently successful and it all be for naught. So in saying any of this, I credit the vast majority of the results shown and the work that's gone into this into those athletes who have completed this. In this manner, however, we as coaches basically serve to guide and edify an athlete's training. But we are most importantly, and I really want to underscore this before we go in, we are first privileged to have them on board and to have them in our corner. We are then trusted, and only at that point are we coaches. So we are first privileged, we are then trusted, and at that point, we are then coaches. So let's get into it. The first person is going to be George. He is an under 66 kilo open lifter. He was in a wheelchair about 36 weeks ago, and made a huge recovery and a really big turnaround into becoming the best under 66 NIPF of all time on record. Trigger warning, I am going to show a photo of his ankle, so if you're not that keen on this, you might want to look away. He had been forced to drop out of nationals in 2025, so he was literally in the lead up to it. He was during his peak block. He was walking into it with 2 injuries already, so he was going on with like ongoing lumbar aggravation, which they had suspected was a QL strain. And then he had a really severe shoulder aggravation from a failed re-rack on bench. It was then this third one which kind of delivered the final blow for him and took him out of the competition, which is where he broke his ankle walking back on a squat. So that section that you can see of his ankle that's bruised was actually what hit the floor. So he squats in a squat shoe. Seems to have caught some sort of rubber during a walkout while he was taking the bar out of the rack, went over on his ankle, broke his ankle, and then obviously the bar proceeded to go the rest of the way to the floor. He's actually very lucky that it was only his ankle. He was able to bail the bar off of his back before his hips hit the floor as well, because if we had had both of those at the same time, we would have been in a lot more trouble. So really lucky to come off with what he did. Now, what's really interesting is whenever he first came to me, he was entirely, and I really do mean this, entirely unable to squat or deadlift in any capacity, but be it that was mental or be it that was physical, which I'm going to suggest was a really strong incorporation of both. You can see that this is on the 1st of the 9th, 2025. I'm sorry if this is a little bit small, but you can see that there's very little that we could do here. You can see his total weekly working volume was 18 reps of bench press, nothing on squat, nothing on deadlift. We were giving him some things as best we could to try and kind of get him used to it. So started to give him like graded exposure, and that's going to be the huge underlying principle of this, is giving him graded exposure so that he would be able to get back into this. So this was all really, really soft stuff. All of this was ramped really soft, like I'm talking half an RPE, if that, per week. And this continued out throughout his first 2 full blocks. So we essentially did this, introduced some other variations where we were strengthening the tissues around that damaged area, and just being, again, very, very heavy on graded exposure, not jumping into anything too quickly whatsoever. To take us then to block 2, this is where we move into getting him into some really modified variations, but getting him closer to what a squat and a deadlift would be. So you can see on his day 1 there, we have an SSB squat. We actually ended up, if you see on week 3 of that, we actually ended up changing that to a different SSB, which is, it's essentially a Mars bar. So the SSB that he was using was putting it very high on his traps, which was very much keeping him in a high bar position. We then moved over by week 3 into a Mars bar, which gave him a little bit more access to his, essentially to his posterior chain. The only reason that we did that right enough is because you can see in the week prior, you can see his SLDL on his day 2, week 2, got to 100 kilos at a 6.5. So once we started to see these signs of like, okay, he's actually able to use his lumbar a little bit more and use his posterior chain a bit more in the deadlift and in the areas that we're very much focusing on, then we started to move over with that into his squat as well. You can see obviously throughout, there's certain things that are kept a little bit more static. So like his barbell RDL work was kept a little bit more static. Right enough, 3x6 is not an incredible amount of volume on that either. But you can also see that he has some walking lunges in here. That was like, for whatever reason, I know it's not necessarily like the traditional route. And what I kind of want to highlight here is very little of this is going to be the traditional route, because there's not much traditional about these people's situations. But these walking lunges were actually fantastic. Like, these served to really get him much more used to placing the foot and having confidence in placing the foot. This was arguably a more psychological programming decision than it was like a mechanical or a biomechanical or a metabolic programming decision. We were really, really looking at the psychology behind this, and there's a lot of that throughout. But you can see there's a few different changes that happened throughout this period where we started to really develop things as we go. We then got into here, which this is where we started to get things really pivotal. So this is only block 3. Again, was in a wheelchair right before he came in. In block 3, we start introducing like full squats and full deadlifts. So we had seen that he was progressing really, really well with the SSB work on squats, and he was progressing really, really well with the SLDL work. And so we decided, okay, let's have a really soft introduction of some proper squat and deadlift work at this point. So you can see in week 1, we started with that 3x5 and that 3x4. Only 1 day a week of each of these right now, so we weren't jumping into a much more traditional like 4 days a week bench, 2 days a week squat, 2 days a week deadlift. We wanted to make sure that we were really, really careful with this. That then developed into, so in speaking to him in this first week, things were actually going very, very well along these lines, and we were comfortable to push these. You can see on the day 4 there, those barbell RDLs ended up getting pushed right up to the 8. He was just feeling so much more confident with it, and it was time to kind of break the mold and break the barrier as far as being able to actually load these tissues was concerned. Then into the week 2, which is why we start introducing these top sets. So you can see we literally just added a 1x3 on each of those, right? So there's not really anything like particularly special going on here, but this is really just highlighting how long this graded exposure actually ended up taking with this individual. It was at this point then, so that was block 3, we had that introduction. It was getting through block 4 and then into block 5, where he had decided that he was going to sign up for a competition, which was ballsy to say the least on his part, because he was still very much going through it. But he decided that he was going to go for it. And so we, unfortunately, these like 15 weeks out and 14 weeks out are not accurate to that competition. That is accurate to his current competition, so this is backdated. But this was him kind of entering into a phase where we can start getting a little bit more comfortable with having the predictability of what is actually going to go on at this point. So you can see we're literally taking those triples down to doubles, changing a couple of the volume profiles of things and trying to get as much as we can out of it. I very mistakenly did not write FFE split squats with an S, so that that 3x7 is counting into his total weekly volume of squats, which is giving him 41. In reality, it was probably something closer to 16 or 17, right? Wasn't that high. So all of that strengthening work, however, so those walking lunges, the FFE split squats, there was a lot of stuff that even the incline dumbbell press, like all of this was being kept in because we still felt we needed to strengthen these areas and we weren't confident to just completely get rid of them. Whenever we came into peak, so this was his peak and taper, it was actually really untraditional for him to do his peak. So his peak volume on squat and deadlift was 16 throughout all of his peak block. Didn't actually change to be anything higher than that at any point during his peak. And what I personally think is really interesting about this is that we ended up giving him a 6-week peak. So it's much more like traditional for people to run a 4-week peak. So you have 3 weeks of peak where it would go RP6, RP7, RP8, and then come into a taper, and that would lead you into competition. We decided to extend that by an additional 2 weeks to give him, like, again, we had only ever really used soft ramping the entire time. And so I didn't feel it requisite to suddenly change that. So you can see that even coming into peak, there was actually very little that we ended up changing. And I'll be quite honest, I think that's why this went as well as it did, is that we didn't fundamentally change everything and we didn't jump into what we thought was traditional quite so quickly. We sort of let this take its time, let this develop naturally. All we're really doing, and this is a general principle that I like using a lot as a coach, but we were just trying to tip the head of his program, right? We're not trying to lift it up, turn it around, and get it to face in a different direction. All of a sudden, we're just trying to gently guide it until it makes a nice slow turn in the direction that we want it to go in, right? So peak was basically perfect. I'm gonna say peak was basically perfect. There was very little that he executed wrong or that there were any that I had any real holdups with whatsoever. He did an absolutely phenomenal job going through it, particularly getting into this 197 single on squats. It was kind of at this point that we started realizing that we were like, okay, we're actually on for something quite big here. We were kind of just looking to get him back on the platform, but we were actually looking at something really, really big at this point. George ended up coming into it. Now, we had really aggressively sought to increase his body weight. So over this course, kind of getting into through this first cycle, so his first 25 weeks, George has a thyroid issue. So it can be very difficult for him to manipulate his weight. However, we were able to get him a really, really solid 3 to 3.5 kilos of lean muscle mass on his frame. And when I say lean, like if you ever see George with his shirt off, you will know what I mean. When I say lean, brother is insane. And that is partways because of his thyroid condition, but it was very, very difficult for us to actually be able to put that weight on in a sustainable manner. And so he did an amazing job at being able to get his weight up. But as I say, picture perfect taper, picture perfect day. Ended up going 9 for 9 on the day, took 3 national records. So that was the squat record, bench record, and the total record, which made him the best under 66 performance of all time in the NIPF. He is now facing a really quick turnaround into NI Nationals, which BP have actually just recently changed their qualifying process for the British Nats, so we may not end up doing it. But he is looking at a really quick turnaround now where we've actually started introducing those additional 2 days. So he's had like this full cycle and he's had an amazing performance off of just 1 day a week squatting, 1 day a week deadlifting. So now we're taking the opportunity essentially of using it nationals as a softer meet to be able to test whether he's going to actually deal well with the frequency of those. And a big underscore to this is you cannot kill what refuses to die. George is an incredible athlete from a mindset point of view. Like that guy just had there is not an ounce of quit in that man's body. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn from athletes like this who come in and they are injured or they are in pain and they quite simply understand due process. and they are willing to work with the people that they need to work with, and they're willing to work alongside time. I think that's really, really fundamentally important, is that he was actively watching his program change, sometimes week to week, and was asking, granted, very good questions, but always had a sense of trust in the process of what was going on. And very much earned the process. For those who know, I do not like the phrase trust the process. He very much earned the process by doing everything in his power to be able to make this a successful prep and a successful block. So that's definitely one of the biggest successes that we've had as of recent. Kaylani then, so this is our other lightweight, our female representation of our lighter weight category. She is an under 67.5 kilo lifter. She is in the APF. She went from a 1 year plateau to a literal full state record sweep. So that is SBD total. Took literally everything. What was really interesting about Lani is that whenever she first came in, a lot of what we were doing was not actually hugely successful. So you can see this is an overview of her first cycle for those who aren't familiar with our programming documents. And so you can see her very first estimated 1 rep max, or estimated total, was a 395 kilo total, into the whole way over cycle 1, block 5, week 5. So that is the very, very end of the cycle, being a 400. So a net increase of 5 kilos, but the peak of that being only a 412. So we're not really looking at like these huge differences here. The majority of her first cycle, as I say, was not necessarily massively successful. And it's been really, really interesting to go back and to look at some of the things that were happening during this period and kind of refresh our memory as to what was going on. Lani was riddled by shifting aches and pains. It was really, really interesting because there was no real way to actually pin it down. So it was kind of like a different pain in a different area any given training day. It was really, really odd. It was very, very hard to pin down as far as the rehab work was concerned. And her bench press fatigue. So you can see her bench was literally like flat stalled out. So she went from literally an 85 kilo estimated 1 rep max to an 87 by the end of block, and that also happened to be peak. So you can see that the entire cycle on paper was not exactly all that successful, by way of data. However, this actually set the score for us in a lot of different ways. Like there was a lot of learning that was done at this point with Lani's protocol. And it was whenever we got into her bench press. So we started moving a couple things around with her bench press. She would kind of, bless, she'll know that I'll say this. She was kind of overshooting her tertiary days, to be totally honest. She was kind of gunning for more than what was actually there. And I think it was just having the understanding of wave loading and giving her an opportunity to actually create space. At the time, I had consulted with both Adam and Cheryl surrounding her program, and we had kind of discussed together and changed some of what was going on, where we moved her tempo bench day. If it was going to live at such a high intensity, we were going to move it to be slightly further away from the primary on the microcycle. But the way that that would work with a wave load is that it would actually be the day immediately prior, and so it would in some ways serve as a load limited primer session, which is quite interesting. She's essentially running a double primary here on bench press, and instead of having her peak and trough twice a week as far as wave loading is concerned, we just had her peak and trough once a week during the microcycle. Right, it just happened to be ever so slightly staggered with that primary, that first primary in the week one, I'm sorry, in the day one, and then her second in the day 4. Her tertiary, however, now this was actually really interesting because this was her quaternary. This ended up working really, really well. We took her, so you can see her block, what her block 2 is, this green block over here on the left. You can see in her day 2, she'd have a 3-count pause single, and then she'd have a 2x5 right after it. That ended up churning the 6.5 whenever she did the load selection of 72.5 kilos. So it seemed that this was getting kind of pushed on a little bit too far and there wasn't enough space being generated. So to take this out of her hands, we essentially took you can see this little formula that's there on the block 3, week 1, day 2, where we took the estimated 1 rep max of the day prior and regulated a percentage based off of its performance. So if she went and vastly overshot her close grip double, it didn't matter because it was still based off of the E1RM churn, not anything else. Rather than us like specifically going with the load that she selected, we made sure that it was relative to her performance on that day prior. At this point, she was taking no rest day from day one into day two. And she had the note of obviously keeping it very, very soft. This actually allowed us to create enough space where she just had this 1x1 3 count. So we entirely took away her volume as well on this. And shifted around some of her volume profiles just so that she was able to actually deal with this a little bit better and it was a bit more manageable for her. From that point, then we came into here. So this is her cycle 2 progression. If I go back very briefly to her cycle 1, you can see her cycle 1 ended on a 400 kilo estimated total. You can see her cycle 2, we basically started straight away at 415. And up until present day, she's currently sitting at a 465. This is a much more on paper successful block, right? Or a much more successful cycle on paper. Now, what was really, really interesting about this is it was literally just using this bench press or just reorganizing her bench press that had given us an opportunity to address the fatigue that was going on in every single microcycle. And her inability to recover, giving her a little bit more space, which kind of established a lower working threshold or like a minimum effective dose, essentially, if you will. So we were really bringing her right down to minimum. I don't like that term, but we'll call it what it is. Then getting into cycle 2, the best thing that actually happened out of this was off the back of those changes. So that taught her at baseline load selection, RPE selection, and pacing with load in blocks. So she was much, much better from that point at being able to select her loads or have advice in selecting her loads week on week so that she could kind of start with the end in mind when it came to the block rather than being like, I wanted results yesterday, so I'll get them now. And that really, really helped her along in a really big way. So I would actually argue that that may well be more of a contributing factor to her success in cycle 2 than what anything else was. However, it was changing her bench press that actually really helped out with that. So her bench top end expression ended up improving quite greatly, but by the time we got around to her competition in December of 2025, wasn't quite satisfactory. So she actually went 1 for 3 on her bench press. She opened with breaking her own state record or extending her own state record, but when taking a 5 kilo jump into 80, some really interesting technical issues came up, which led us into some really interesting programming decisions as time went on. So this was leading her into her, you can see this is her last heavies from that prep. And then this was her taper on her block 2 week 1. And then her block 2 week 2 is whenever we got her into like the new protocol. So few key things happened off the back of competition that we learned. The first being that her technical limitations were observed and noted, which was on the day. I was actually pleasantly privileged to be able to go in and handle her in person. We noticed some of those. We had a discussion about it. Her squat volume right off the bat was one of the things that we increased actually relatively aggressively, going from 23 in peak straight up to a 35. It's not a huge difference, like it's only 12 working reps a week, but given the percentage increase, actually relatively high. Her Spoto bench press was a massive, massive gamble. Like I actually really rolled the dice on this, but my gut was like very, very strong in telling me that that was the thing that we needed to do. And I'll explain that very briefly. And then the deadlift, we changed her pause deadlift from being off the floor to being just below the knee. So her squat was actually relatively straightforward. It was quite simply, I think we need a higher dosage of volume within the week and to be able to give her an opportunity to build through that. The Spoto, well, actually, let me explain the deadlift first because that's the easier one to explain. Lanny competes in the APF, which is a like daughter federation of WPC. They use a deadlift bar. So she would experience like a lot of whip whenever it came to lockout. So she'd get out of her legs just a smidge early and she'd kind of feel that whip pull her torso down in front of her. before she was able to actually get the shoulders back just by being out of her legs a little bit too early. And so in changing that pause from her starting position was really, really solid from that point, but it was simply just the maintenance of her staying in her legs in the late phase of the deadlift concentric, where we decided to change that pause to being just below the knee. And that seemed to really, really help her cue getting that extension and getting the shoulders back just a little bit earlier so that she was able to lock kind of the hips and the knees closer together. Obviously, in sumo deadlift, you're almost always going to lock the knees first, but it was a lot closer, and so that mitigated quite a lot of that like bar flutter that was actually actively pulling her down. Um, the Spoto, this was so interesting. So on her second and third attempts, she had gotten down, touched her chest, gotten the press command, and the bar would actually come straight away from her chest and then glide down and touch her rib cage again. So Lani gets in a really, really extreme position. Like Lani's actually like got a lot of thoracic mobility. And so she was able to get into quite an extreme position, but she would touch quite high on her chest. So she's in quite a lot of internal rotation at the shoulder. And so it was quite literally a huge gamble because we've went and we've seen that her touch point is too far up her chest. We've went, APF does not have a elbow depth rule. We can kind of abuse the position that you're in and push that touch point a little bit further down because you're already in like quite a lot of internal rotation. So there's room for us to be able to just drop this bar down a little touch. The first thing that you would think is probably not Spoto because you're changing the touch point, and so you'd probably want someone to have a touch point if you're going to change it. It kind of went against the very basic mold of let's change the touch point, but then let's remove it on one of your variations per week. Usually you would actually like to have it be represented at every point during the session, or I'm sorry, during the week. You can see that we went from a 2x2, so I actually wanted this partway psychologically. It did seem to be a little bit of a mental block that once she hit 80, because she had doubled 82 in prep. I want to note that she had doubled 82 in prep. And then coming into the day had missed 80 twice. So we really, really looked at this, and she seemed to have in discussion with her in an after action report call, she seemed to have a very, very, very big psychological barrier surrounding 80. Like she seemed quite afraid of it. So Spoto was introduced to kind of give her an overloading variation additionally, but also to give her kind of room to be able to figure out her internal external rotation, just having it barely off the chest. Now, this ended up proving like wildly successful. I mean, wildly successful. You can see she immediately started breaking through. So we have in these earlier blocks, we have this like 85, 82, 85 estimated 1 rep maxes. This very quickly climbed up to what it is currently, which is a 97.5 kilo E1RM. Like this ended up being wildly successful really, really quickly. And was a gamble at best. Like we really did roll the dice on this. We were working off of baseline principles, obviously, and we were working off of strong foundations, but the practical application of this was rather nuanced. But it ended up paying us really, really well. My decision in going from the 2x2 and a 1x6, we later developed the volume on the 1x6 into a 2x6, and then dropped it from a 2x6 into a 3x4 in later stages, and dropped off the 2x2 to a 1x2. So she was getting a lot more confident with the movement. We didn't feel that we needed the volume exposure, and we actually started leaning more towards like absolute load and getting more absolute load in her hands. The stimulus was turning out really, really soft. I mean, she ended up doing like I don't think I have it screenshotted here, but she ended up doing like an 82 kilo Spoto double for a 2x2 at like a 5.5. And her Spoto really was only about an inch above her chest, if that. So it ended up being wildly successful. She went from all of these decisions. So our cycle 2 block 1 went from a 410 E total into a 455 E total by cycle 2 block 4. So this was literally in the space of 3 blocks, being able to increase her overall estimated total. This is obviously in a weekly max, so this isn't actually best off block. This is of that week. Was a 410 to a 455. So she did absolutely huge things in this process. Lani, again, is another one of those athletes who puts so much into this. She had a huge trust in the process. She is a coach herself. She asked some really, really, really good questions, sought a really deep understanding. And it was going through and her being willing to kind of roll the dice on Spotto that really gave us this big, big payoff. She is currently in prep for APF Nationals. Her last meet was actually a rather soft meet. That was the one that gained her 400 dots. Um, Heaven knows what she will do. She just sent me a single PB that she got, um, literally like 20 minutes before this started. So she's getting into like really, really kind of terrifying levels of strength at the moment where it's almost more than what we know what to do with. But Lani is one who very much believes that athlete is a way of life. There's so much of what she does in the day in and the day out of how she looks after herself, whether it's through that moving pain or whether it's keeping herself healthy or whether it's continuing to perform as a high level coach. Athlete is very much a way of life for Kaylani. Getting into the next one, Kyle. Kyle is this is like a representation of male representation of a heavier weight category. Kyle is an under 93 kilo lifter. It was a lot of this is actually getting into mental health, and how some mindset changes yielded some insanely big impact with him. Whenever Kyle had first came in, there was nothing really astounding about what was going on with his protocol. Quite simply, he had just finished off a triples block with the previous coach. He'd then come to me. I decided to run the kind of next natural progression, which was to give him top, you can see top set doubles here, from a hard triple warm up. So this is just kind of gauge him out a little bit, have us have a better understanding of his load selections and kind of tame him in. He seemed to really, really like to go for it whenever it came to doubles, and so we wanted to kind of rein him in a little touch. So nothing necessarily. I mean, he'll appreciate me saying this. Nothing extraordinary here. With a 540 kilo E1 or E total. I'm sorry. 76 working reps a week. So not crazy here. Not crazy at all. His first cycle progression was really, really good, however. So he went from a 527 there, you can see in cycle one, block one, week one. And we actually grazed 600. It won't tell you that it's 600, but you can see over here that it lands right on the 600 mark. So it was really big for us to get that by the time we got into block five, week three, of just watching this natural progression. Now, with him, this was really interesting actually, because again, this is kind of untraditional. So his entire cycle one was essentially establishing some fundamentals, right? We were kind of having Kyle relearn some better habits, I'll say, for want of a better term, surrounding block pacing, load selection, warm-up protocol, warm-up selection, all the rest of it, right? So this was actually really, really fundamental stuff. And it was just the fundamentals executed well that within his first cycle took him up to that 600 kilo. You can actually see it's right here. Took him into that 600 kilo estimated total. Now, he had been signed up for a meet and decided to drop out at this point, and so we decided to run a mock meet. We were halfway through the peak anyway, and he was keen on being able to express some of that strength within the first cycle. And so we decided to run a mock meet. This actually gave us some really good data on his expression. So you can actually see that he did this single at 192 and 8.5. And then coming to on the day, actually only ended up with a 185 at 9. What I think had actually happened here is that was his last, from my memory, that was his last warm up. And then his top, he had attempted a 195 to try and chip this. So he had taken a 10 kilo jump in, and it was that he failed. So he then put down what he actually ended up with, being a mock meet. This would have otherwise been the successful attempt. So really, really interesting. Also give us a good look at like what his peak and taper should actually look like. So obviously you can see that this did not go to plan. We had planned out a third day here for him to complete on the Thursday, have the mock meet be on the Saturday, which wasn't ended up completed. That probably left him being a little bit less fresh coming into it, right? So he's probably feeling a little bit out of touch, just based off a couple of the other things that we had done anyway. And he was already on the high end of this single at 4.5 to 5. He was already on that high end with a 5 on that squat single of taper. So there's a few things that were going on. It was actually at this point that Kyle had a long-standing discussion with myself and we had decided that for some mental health reasons and generally for the improvement of his mental health, that he be in the gym more frequently, and that he spend more time in the gym. Really odd because most powerlifters want in the gym for less time. Kyle was actually the polar opposite if he wanted to be able to be busy and to take his mind off of things a little bit more. And so we gave him this fifth day. That developed shortly after. Now this was so interesting. Amelia will remember this because she'll remember the heart attack I had during this point. It was in cycle 2, block 1, week 5 that Kyle developed neuropraxia. So he essentially had a stunned nerve, and his bench press dropped off from a 107. So this is a competition bench press. You can see this day 4. He had a 107 triple at 5. The next week it was a 60 kilo triple. I'm not stuttering. A 60 kilo triple at 7. The following week was a 40 kilo triple at 6. Really whack. Very, like, so interesting. Literally the only thing that I have to say about this is that he was playing golf at the time. And I think that golf was the thing that aggravated him. So if any of you are powerlifters and you're also enjoying your golf, just be careful. Yeah. Make sure you're training well and like actually prepared for doing what you're doing. Don't be like, throwing your driver at the ball. So it was a really interesting series of events that ended up actually happening. The issue with the stunned nerve, and Amelia will remember this because I was having a heart attack every other day, and Callum will remember it too because I nearly cried over the phone to him, was I was like, I've killed this man. I've moved up to 5 days a week, and now he's dead. Uh, which obviously not actually, but I fully felt responsible for what was going on here. Turns out that was not actually the case. He was in the middle of looking at actually competing in this time. So we had changed him to 5 days a week. He had dropped out of his previous competition. He had done a mock meet, didn't quite go as well. We got some really good data, changed him into 5 days a week, entered a comp prep again, developed neuropraxia, and just dropped out of competition again. Right? Really difficult set of circumstances, particularly when the decision that was made to go into 5 days a week was fully off the basis of going, we want to improve your mental health here. And then all of a sudden being unable to bench like 50 kilos without it going to an RP7. Really interesting experience. We made some really in-depth technical changes at this point. So this is significantly later on. This is taking us into, where is this, block 4 of his protocol, where we had this successful doubles block. It was still at this point that we were not reintroducing bench, bear in mind. So we were not able to reintroduce primary bench at this point with his neuropraxia. We had introduced some of these, you can see on his day 1, some cable press arounds. We were kind of giving him some stuff to be able to increase the proprioception in the area as best he could. He was like frequently complaining of his tricep just like not working, like at all. Like it was just soft, entirely soft, and he was getting a little bit of muscle wastage here and there. And so there were a few things that we were trying to do. You can see that dumbbell chest press as well in there. That's just kind of in an effort to load that unilaterally, and if there was a weakness on one side, that be able to be addressed. You can see as well cable overhead tricep extensions, just trying to get his shoulder in that position and try to be able to isolate the tricep a little bit more. So there's a few things that we're trying to be doing to increase proprioception from the point of him developing neuropraxia. Up until this point, then you can see there's a few things in there, like machine chest press too. There's some stuff that we otherwise just do not necessarily program. But when you're so limited on bench press, it can sometimes be requisite that you do these things. Then this week 3, so obviously week 3 is not week 3 of an actual block. We restarted a new block at this point, and we reintroduced bench press. Again, brother was in competition prep here, and he had felt that he had come around from his neuropraxia. He had went to a couple of neuromuscular therapy appointments, and was really feeling good to go ahead with this. I had spoken to him like 4 or 5 different times to be like, bro, are you sure? Had assured me that he was, so we went into it anyway. It was from this point, really, you can see down there, like his estimated weekly totals were 550, 567 and a half. And again, like he had started at, what was that, like a 520 odd whenever he came in, and then after some neuropraxia, he's literally left himself off at 550. So again, like, yes, there's increase, but it's not astounding. coming into this phase then where we made some technical changes, we started really focusing on his mindset and who he was as a person, and where his self-belief was, where his self-respect was, where his self-worth was. And it was actually developing those that above anything else yielded the highest returns. And so this is actually like almost to the date the times where we started to see a really significant improvement in his mental health was coming into cycle 3. And I want to underscore this because you can see that that has like almost instantaneously jumped up to 665 kilos of anyone, or an estimated total. It's really interesting that that ended up being the thing that was most highly reflective on his estimated totals. Now, previous blocks certainly contributed. Like, let me not say that that this is conclusive. However, what I will say is that I know for a matter of fact that it is Kyle's self-belief now and what that has essentially enabled him to do. Like, Kyle would not have believed in himself enough to execute, nor would he have respected himself enough to be able to do the rehab, or to be able to take care of himself, or get enough rest, or watch his caffeine consumption. Like, he would not have had the level of self-respect that he actually needed to be able to progress, right? And so it is sometimes so important to remember that you're dealing with human beings. You're not just dealing with athletes, you're dealing with humans. Um, and I want to underscore this by saying that prioritizing athletes' health, both mental and physical, is not preference. It is absolutely imperative. Like, there is no other way around this. You are dealing with a human being. You do not have to be their therapist, but you do have to be their confidant, and you do have to work around the stimulus that they're getting, be that positive or negative. Um, I'm so proud of Kyle, like, for everything that he's done, and again, like, he is also another one who's an absolute warrior. But he went from cycle 1, block 1, you can see there. So that was whenever he first came in. He had a 527 kilo estimated total. Cycle 3, block 1, so 2 full cycles later, and he has a 665 estimated total. Beyond proud is really all I can say. Beyond proud. I'm really pleased with this guy and everything that he's done. Moving across, again, what the mind believes, the body achieves. Like, Kyle is very much a living example of that. Sophie then is our heavier representation from the female category at the under 84 class. She actually used to be an 84 plus. She went from like literal constant self-doubt, like chronic undershooter because she would not select the loads that she was capable of, to a record holder and an international competitor who was my first international cap as an athlete. That's hilarious because that's not supposed to be there. The first cycle, this was actually really interesting. There was a few things that happened in and across this, and in the interest of time, much of this happened very similar than the other people, right? It was like the same baseline principles that are going on here. Principles of graded exposure, changing around volume profiles, discovering what works best for this athlete, and being able to work and develop them in the way that they need. Coming in with like a 402 kilo estimated total the moment that she walked in the door, and kind of living in and around that area. You can see these were times where we were off or we were on holiday or whatever, and we weren't able to get representation from all of them. So you can see the data is a little bit skewed here, so you can ignore these as abnormalities. But she placed, let me get this up very briefly. Why is that blank? Oh, here we go. So really interestingly, this was her leading into her small nations prep. So this is her last heavies, and her taper for small nations, and then the week after, which is whenever we started kind of aggressively changing her protocol. So she had placed third at nationals in the 84 plus kilo category. We had then decided she was easily one of the lightest people there in the category, and so we decided that, you know what, we're going in this direction anyway, and so we cut her down into the under 84s as well. She won her qualifier meet for small nations. It was at that point that she took the squat record, the NIPF squat record, which actually gave her a 0.5 kilo chip on the day to win, which then took her to small nations. So that was a really important win for her. It was literally half a kilo that got her her international singlet. Um, Now have a look at this peak and taper. This was on paper great. So she did this 166 kilo squat at a 7.5, so she actually didn't even meet the 8. Her 175 deadlift was fantastic at the 8 as well. And then her competition bench press being a 76 kilo at an 8 as well. And she's saying it's slightly soft at that, right? A lot of really, really good things were happening during this. She had actually ended up having to travel halfway through her taper to obviously head out to Luxembourg for an international comp. And so her tempo squats were taking a little bit softer. Now, in saying that, I think that that last taper session probably could have been changed a little bit more. I think that her response to travel was not quite what we anticipated. In other words, she reacted worse to travel than what we were anticipating. And so there were probably a couple of things that we could have done, in fairness, in her prep and in her taper that we would have changed about a little bit just to get a slightly better result. However, look at those last heavies. She went in two small nations and went 6 for 9. She came in at the same weight that she came in last time. The cut was really no harder. She was actually sitting higher coming into it. And it was literally just last little second, just tipping her in, very little physiological stress. Placed fourth. If I were to pull up the open powerlifting, she actually missed out on that by 2.5. She missed out on podium by 2.5 kilos. Really, really interesting. Right, peak and taper was looking really, really good. Nothing that we necessarily could have known about beforehand. Still comes out with obviously this 9.5 kilo total PB, which is fantastic. First international meet is also amazing. Like, do not get me wrong, there's no part of this that I want to discredit. Sophie put in an insane amount of work into this. By the way, Sophie is a mother. And so there is a lot of pressure outside of the gym. Like she may not necessarily have the same resources that, some of us young, single, no children people have going on, right? She has a lot more responsibilities as a mother. And so going and doing this was actually a really, really big sacrifice on her part. Going 6 for 9 really stung her. Whenever we looked at it, one of the things that the team did at the time, so the international handling team did, was they sent out a form. Now this is not the form that they sent out, but this is quite simply what we ended up doing in the day. So this was our attempt selection card. This is kind of what we had plotted out based off of her last heavies and how we've seen some of her other peaks and tapers go, and what we felt was really, really reasonable. So these numbers were actually on the softer side of things, right? So we were not necessarily, it's first international meet. We weren't actually even thinking about a placement like for podium. We were quite simply just going, enjoy your first international, like it's an international 3 lift meet. You go out there and you enjoy yourself more than anything else, right? We weren't actually worried about placement or performance. Really just getting her to go 9 for 9 was one of the biggest priorities. Getting into this, so Sophie's actually quite interesting in that we like to give her much longer to warm up on squats. She is a very stretch reflex squatter, right? So she'll descend into the hole quite quickly and she'll rely on that stretch reflex to be able to get her up and out of the hole and the rest of the way through. Depth has never traditionally been an issue, right? This on paper really straightforward. Like it's really just a timing thing where I've written down the times here, obviously, of giving her about 25, realistically probably 30 minutes to warm up her squats, just so that she's able to, get her bands out, get her blood rate up, or her heart rate up, whatever else she needs, just to be able to get in there. Part of this is also psychological, and I want to underline this. A lot of athletes, if they are really jittery coming into squats, you actually want to give them longer to warm up, and you want to give them less caffeine. I found that to be insanely successful in that you just get them to go out for their first and they are literally cool as a cucumber. Like you do not get them worked out for love nor money. Like you want to keep these people as docile as possible for their first squat and set the standard, just set themselves up for the execution. With that in mind, this looks really straightforward. But what if we did this? This is essentially what happened on the day. So 3 of her warm-ups were taken out from squat. What she had said to me on the phone in the after action report was that 3 from each of them were taken out. Now, obviously, the numbers are definitely, if anyone was sensible, the numbers are going to be manipulated to be able to accommodate for this, right? Because these jumps would have been insane otherwise. So some of the numbers would probably change as a result. However, the time that was taken was greatly reduced. Like, I mean, greatly reduced. With this, when you look at it this way, her performance makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? Her performance makes a lot more sense. 6 for 9 day. You can see that her third squat she missed. She actually ended up getting that attempt, but missed it on depth, which again traditionally was never an issue. Her second bench press moved phenomenally, so she took the more aggressive option in an attempt to make up for that. Clearly was unprepared for it. And then missed her second deadlift on grip and retook it just to be able to get it in. It makes a lot more sense whenever you sit. Now, I'm not saying that any one of these issues is directly a result of the warm-up protocol and what happened, but it was damn well a contributing factor. And I think anyone who has handled an athlete on the day would know that. If you are to send out a document beforehand, please adhere to it beyond anything. I actually do want to give a brief note on this to those who play an infinite game. So any one of these athletes, those who play an infinite game, success is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. So the infinite game is essentially that the only objective to the game is that you keep playing the game, whereas a finite game is one where you have an objective, and once you complete that objective, the game ends. And so for those who are playing an infinite game, success is not a matter of if, or I'm sorry, yes, it is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. I do want to also briefly speak to handling. Handling absolutely changes the game. And this is actually like not said with any amount of animosity. This is just my general and well, rather genuine belief surrounding handling. An athlete's performance on the day is a culmination of months, sometimes years. So, for example, George had been 18 months since he had competed last until that performance of sometimes intense work, very, very often battling physical or emotional pain. In Dedicated by Design, there's a reason why athlete first is such a strong motif within the brand. And it's because we genuinely mean that. If you are not having a discussion with an athlete before you handle them, you had better. You really, really ought to. You need to be doing right by those athletes. Um, Furthermore, if you are an international coach and you are not sending out documents so that you can understand that athlete and what their warm-ups are and what their attempts are being and what their openers are placed at, you ought to. If you're an international handler and you're sending out that document and you're not looking at that, you ought to. If you are a handler and you are hungry, because I've seen this in a few different instances across the world, if you are hungry and you are handling an athlete, you'll be fine for another couple hours. You'll not die. You might be a bit uncomfortable, but you'll not die, right? You put yourself to one side for those athletes. It has been months. You will survive 2 hours of a tummy ache for this athlete's months or years of prep. Dedicated by Design, we've kind of been, and this has also been my experience, where we've been kind of spoiled by having really, really good handlers and really, really good handling teams, and we take our handling very, very seriously, and it's a rigorous process to become a certified, trained handler of the brand. It astonishes me that I see so frequently people leaving their athletes to go and get food in the middle of deadlift warm-ups and hand their attempt slip to someone else who perhaps doesn't know the athlete. I've seen that happen in 2 or 3 different cases. Like there was one that happened recently. In fairness, it's local to me, but I've seen a few of those happen in America, in Ireland, in the UK. I've seen this happen a few different times, which I think is appalling behavior at best. And if you feel called out by that, good. People who send out documents and then don't adhere to what was said in the document, much like Sophie, as a handler, that those months and months of prep fall into your hands for that time that you have that athlete. Like you are make or break at that point. You really, really are. And so if there's anything that you find yourself doing out of your own convenience as a handler, I would ask you to put your selfishness to one side for a moment and consider what is actually going to be best for the athlete and not what is going to be most convenient for yourself. I do not care how many plates you have to put on or take off of a bar to make sure that people get their attempts right or that they get their warm-ups right. That does not matter. That athlete is your absolute priority on that day. My rant is over. I do feel very, very strongly about that though. Again, the baseline principle, progress is never given, it is earned. Progress as a coach, in order for us to progress as coaches, we willingly right our wrongs and consistently seek to expand our understanding. We have a duty to those who entrust us with their career. And there's a reason that I say that is because I think that that demands a level of respect that people may not necessarily give. Any athlete who comes to you has an athletic career with you. And so treat it as a career, regardless of their current skill level. The progress that we've seen in some of the E1RMs that you've seen and the massive growth that you've seen out of some of these athletes today is absolutely not a coincidence. This has come from months and months of collaborative work between other coaches, other athletes, multiple people having eyes on a protocol at any given time, and every one of us subscribing to a iterative, collaborative coaching experience that is designed from the ground up with the athlete first in mind. If you have thought at any point during this that you're like, gosh, I would really love to have that experience, and you're maybe not quite there yet, I really want to highlight to you that it is literally just around the corner. It is not that far. There are sometimes weeks and months of work that it takes to be able to have a big breakthrough, but I promise that if you are in a slump right now, continue to communicate with your coach, continue to consult with qualified professionals, and I promise you that as you continue to put in high quality input, you will get back high quality output. If you are playing an infinite game, success is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. Thanks.